Alright, it's time for round 2 of the Sega Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. Which similarly named game do I prefer? Well, let's get started with a little Batman Returns. Based on the Tim Burton movie, you play as Batman protecting Gotham City from the Penguin. The Genesis game is a frustrating side-scrolling action game with dark visuals and horrible Jim's music. The graphics are really grainy looking with not a lot of details. One of the worst Batman games I have ever played. The Super Nintendo game is a far more appealing side-scrolling beat-em-up. I love the different ways you can pummel your opponents. You can smash them into the wall or into the ground, just like in the movie. The game looks nicely detailed and the music is absolutely top-notch. So it's pretty clear which of these two games I prefer. The Genesis game is dark and annoying to play, while the Super Nintendo game is a total blast. Battletoads and Double Dragon. In 1993, Trade West decided to merge two beat-em-up franchises into one, and I'm not sure this really works. Considering the sci-fi setting, it's more of a Battletoads game. Anyway, the Genesis game looks and sounds very lackluster, much like this commentary. The music isn't terrible, though. On the other hand, the Super Nintendo game's music is amazing. It's got a rocking style that fits the game nicely. The images are a bit more detailed, but the gameplay is essentially the same. This game can be tough on both systems. Sometimes the enemies will attack you from both sides, which is totally uncool. But which one did I like better? They're essentially the same in gameplay, but I prefer the Super Nintendo game's smoother music and graphics. Boogerman, a pick-and-flick adventure. Here's a weird, gross-out platformer surely every mom would love. Play as Boogerman, a middle-aged wannabe superhero on a mission to defeat Professor Stinkbomb. Run, jump, burp, and pick your nose to attack. Rad! The controls are very good and the gameplay is fun enough, not too difficult. The sounds are nice and clear, which is unusual for a Genesis game. Oh, and the animation of Boogerman himself is really good. Over on the Super Nintendo, there's not much different. The music is a little bit lower in volume than the Genesis, which is probably a good thing. The artwork is essentially identical to the Genesis game, right down to the dithering. Would have been nice if they'd have used the transparency features of the system. There can be some slowdown if there's too many enemies on the screen. Both games are mostly the same, so choosing one over the other is really unnecessary, much like the reason to play it nowadays. All kidding aside, it's a pretty good platformer, which is decent enough on both systems. Bulls vs. Blazers in the NBA playoffs. Here's a 5-on-5 basketball game from EA Sports. I actually have this one for the Genesis, and I played it a lot. I really liked the detailed player graphics and the fact that you could play as Michael Jordan. This was before he was way too expensive to be included in a video game.
Time violation.
As you can see, however, the animation is slow and choppy. Pressing the buttons also seems a bit laggy. Really, the whole game just lacks energy, which is what NBA games should be known for.
3,
This was the first time I played the Super Nintendo game, and it's, well, essentially the same, but worse. I think the court graphics look better, but the entire game is just zoomed in, which is a problem with many Super Nintendo games due to its lower resolution. Also, there's no voice announcing the foul you committed. What, you expect me to read it? For me, personally, I think the Genesis game is better. Sports games were just meant to be on this system thanks to its faster processor and higher resolution. ClayFighter. This terrible fighting game exists because everyone wanted to cash in on the success of Mortal Kombat. Who the heck bought this? Imagine getting this for Christmas instead of Mortal Kombat. Ugh. The animation is pathetic, the sounds are annoying, and the controls are sloppy. Oh, and the gameplay, the most important aspect of any game, it just isn't fun. The Super Nintendo game isn't much better. It still has a ridiculous premise, awful animation, and annoying sound effects. However, the visuals are a tiny bit better and not dithered to high heck like the Genesis game.
Oh, mama. Oh, mama.
Oh, and the music is less grating on the ears. Neither of these games are really worth playing. I'd rather dunk my head into a vat of hot caramel than play these games ever again, but the Super Nintendo game is slightly less annoying. Cool Spot. Here we have a side-scrolling platform game starring everyone's favorite red spot from your favorite soft drink. Anyone remember 7-Up? No? I mean, it kind of disappeared in the past couple of years, huh? Anyway, I've kind of begun to like this game. I love the settings with all the huge objects you have to jump on or get around. The shooting is nice too because you don't have to worry about running out of ammo. Controls and music is good too, but dang, walking feels really slow on Genesis. It's the same game on Super Nintendo, just with nicer graphics and sounds. The music is a little more upbeat too. Spot is a cool character too. Wait a minute, that's why the game is called Cool Spot. Psh, mind blown. There's also some cool lighting effects in Stage 3. Fortunately, the gameplay seems a little bit faster here, which makes it a more pleasant experience. Both games are good and fun experiences, which is not what one would expect from a licensed product game. Anyway, I like the Super Nintendo game just slightly more than the Genesis one. The Death and Return of Superman. This beat-em-up game is based on the 1993 comic book when Superman was killed by Doomsday. Afterwards, you can choose from 4 different Supermen not named Clark Kent. Gameplay is a little boring, but it's okay. What repels me from this game faster than Kryptonite is that awful music. It's more like Chinese ear torture. Ugh. Thankfully, the Super Nintendo game is devoid of the ear torture. Instead, we just have to endure the boring gameplay. As you can see, it's just punch, kick, or heat vision the same enemies over and over again. There's a few cool moves you can perform, like throwing enemies into the walls and stuff, though. There's really no advantage for the Genesis here. Even the real Superman couldn't endure this music for long. Also, the stretch characters on the Super Nintendo are actually a benefit here because Superman looks a lot more buff. Desert Strike, Return to the Gulf. Here we have an isometric helicopter shooting game where you attempt to complete a grand total of 4 missions. You need to shoot the enemy buildings and weapons, all while rescuing POWs. You have guns, rockets, and Hellfire missiles in your arsenal. I love the clear and detailed graphics, even if the animation is a bit choppy. Well, it is a chopper game after all. The Super Nintendo game is similar, of course, but the sound seems a lot richer here. Colors aren't far off from the Genesis game, and the field of view isn't too bad either. I don't think either of these has a significant advantage over the other. The Genesis game is a tiny bit faster though. Controls are good and the gameplay is the same for both, so let's give this one a tie. Earthworm Jim 2. Play as a worm in a supersuit in this side-scrolling action game. The gameplay is a bit harder than the original game, and they've really amped up the weirdness. It's just weird for the sake of being weird. Controls, animation, sounds, and music are all top-notch though. Then here's the Super Nintendo game. The background details look better on most of the stages. Check out the waterfall on stage 1. Whoopee! Later stages have transparencies and background scrolling. Controls aren't as tight as the Genesis game, but the sound effects are better.
Way cool!
This game is hard no matter what system you play it on. It helps if you turn on the cheats like I did. Anyway, it pains me to say this because the game started on Genesis, but I think the Super Nintendo game is more enjoyable for me. Fatal Fury. One of the earlier fighting games to appear on the Neo Geo. It just stands to reason it would appear on the most popular consoles of the day. It's your standard one-on-one combat game, but here we only have 3 characters to start with. What? Well, I always play as Terry Bogard anyways. Like the arcade, there are 2 planes to jump between. However, there's some missing characters and no bonus rounds or mid-bosses. Wow. As for the Super Nintendo, the gameplay is practically identical. However, the sprites are a little bit bigger and the music is a little softer. Also, I see that the shadows are just solid blobs. I thought the Super Nintendo made it easy to do transparencies. Overall, the game looks pretty nice, but I noticed that there's no planes that you can jump between. That's a pretty significant gameplay element that's missing. Neither of these games seems 100% complete. Each is missing something significant, but in this case I think the Genesis has the better game. The Flintstones. Did you know that the Flintstones was the first primetime cartoon before The Simpsons? And that it's based on the Honeymooners show? And it had 2 movies and a theme park based on it? Yep. Sadly, the show's been largely forgotten today. The Genesis game here is a side-scrolling platformer where you play as Fred Flintstone. You can jump or attack and climb by holding the jump button. The Super Nintendo game is kind of a weird board game. Roll the rock for a number and then move your character. When they land on a spot, they have to make their way through the platform area. Honestly, why can't the whole game be just like this? I guess the developers are trying to do something different. The Genesis game is what you would expect from a game like this. It's fun and has some nice visuals and sounds. Weird board games just don't do it for me, Nintendo. Sorry. Frogger, the classic Konami arcade game. Yeah, I thought it was Sega too. Anyway, help your frog across the road and jump on logs or turtles to get home. Pretty basic, but still an incredibly fun game. The Genesis version is very accurate to the arcade game, which I really appreciate. However, the Super Nintendo game is not at all like the arcade. The graphics, sounds, and music are just totally different. They were going for a more realistic look, I guess. It still plays basically the same, though. It just doesn't feel like Frogger. So yeah, I'm gonna go with the arcade accurate port. Why would you want to play anything else? I mean, the music is half the reason I played this game anyway, so I'm going with the Genesis version. Hardball 3. One of the most well-known computer baseball games of the 80s was just naturally going to make its way to game consoles.
Off speed, swung and missed.
It's definitely incredible to look at, but how does it play?
Fly to center. Caught by the shortstop.
Well, first you select your pitch, then hold the controller up, down, left, or right to maneuver it.
Fly ball to right.
Oh, and the voice samples are very choppy and annoying.
A triple for number 25, the left fielder. There's no score. There's one out here in the bottom of the first, with a runner at third.
Over on the Super Nintendo, the game is missing the voice samples from Al Michaels, but I think it's better for it.
Right. Out.
Also, we've got music. It's not baseball music, but it's okay.
Out.
To hit the ball, select your power level, or if you want to bunt or steal.
Out.
Like all baseball games, you gotta get that timing down or you're never gonna hit the ball, like me.
Strike.
Neither version is a good representation of baseball. The animation is not fluid at all, and the choppy Genesis voice is distracting. The Super Nintendo game isn't as annoying to play, but I'd really rather avoid both of them.
Out.
Lethal Enforcers. This is a fairly basic shooting gallery game that originally appeared in the arcades. You can play with the provided Justifier light gun or with a controller. Simply shoot the bad guys on screen, but not the civilians or police. The Genesis game looks incredibly dithered. The Super Nintendo game includes some censorship though. It doesn't show the bloody bullet holes when you get hit, and some of the gang names have been changed. But I do like how there's more variety in the car stage backgrounds, and the images are just nicer overall. So are bloody bullet holes enough to give Sega the edge? Honestly, I didn't even notice until I read about it. Gameplay is identical between the two games, but the Super Nintendo game looks better. I really can't stand all that Sega dithering. Ugh. Mickey Mania, the timeless adventures of Mickey Mouse. Here we have a rather clever action game where you play as Mickey Mouse venturing through different cartoons of his past. You start off with the black and white Steamboat Willie, then the Mad Doctor, Moose Hunters, and more. I like some of the cool special effects of the game, like this rotating tower, or when you run from the moose. That just looks very cool. The Super Nintendo game has a significant problem. It has loading times. This is a cartridge, not a CD. This should be loaded instantly. This version also has missing animations, the removal of Pluto, a bonus stage, and one of the tower stages. Otherwise, it's a decent version of the game. Between the two though, I prefer the Genesis game mostly for its instant loading. It's got a lot better resolution with no cropping too. The music and graphics may not be as good though. Mortal Kombat 2. The best fighting game ever made, and I will die on that hill. I played the Genesis game a ton back in the day. In fact, I just got my cartridge box signed by some of the original actors from the game. Anyway, the Genesis version is a little stripped down from the arcade, I'll grant you that. The visuals aren't as good, the sounds are a little scratchy, and the characters are smaller with less animation. But the gameplay is still there, and it's fast and fun.
Finisher.
The Super Nintendo has an awesome version of the game. It includes several stage details missing from the Genesis game, like floating characters, hanging chains, flying creatures, and stuff like that.
Gotcha! Come here!
There's also more parallax layers in the background and even more voice. The downside is that the inputs feel a little slow sometimes. I don't know, I think my fingers are faster than the Super Nintendo. So this will probably be a controversial pick because I'm basing it on my own nostalgia, which means I'd gravitate to the Genesis game above all others, even if other versions are admittedly better looking and sounding. I will say though that I feel the Genesis game is faster and plays a tinge better than the Super Nintendo game. Okay, once again, it's time to swap to make it fair. Let's talk about the Super Nintendo game first, and then the Genesis game. Pit Fighter, the original digitized fighting game from Atari Games. Play in an arena, mercilessly attacking your opponent with punches, kicks, sticks, and barrels. You can even land blows while they're knocked down. Now, the Super Nintendo game is one of the worst conversions ever made. First of all, why do you have to press select to choose your fighter? Why not use the control pad? Also, there's no health bar, it's just numbers. And there's no weapons either. What the heck? But the worst offense? No continues, making this game literally impossible to win. Sure, the Genesis game is no masterpiece, don't get me wrong, but it is much closer in play to the arcade than the Super Nintendo game. The health bar is there, there's lots of weapons, and you do have continue, so you might just make it to the boss. Neither of these games are great, but the Genesis has a far more faithful version of the arcade game. Primal Rage. This is Atari Games' classic dinosaur brawling game that was a big hit, but it could have been even bigger if it had used more standard movesets. Instead, you have to hold buttons down, then move the stick to perform special moves. The Super Nintendo version has nice voice and sound effects, good gameplay, and multiple layers of parallax. The downside is how lifeless the backgrounds are. I mean, there's not even color cycling on the water. The Genesis game has better looking backgrounds, but smaller characters. Also, this version is based on an earlier arcade version, so it has fewer special moves than the Super Nintendo game. But at least it has that golden shower fatality, which is the most important one. I feel that the Super Nintendo game is technically better overall, and it would be a slam dunk if the backgrounds were a little better. But just like with Mortal Kombat 2, I'd lean towards playing the Genesis version. I don't know, I just like it better. Race Drivin. Believe it or not, back in the day, Hard Drivin and Race Drivin were highly respected arcade games. They were a little dull in the gameplay department, but there was always a line of people waiting to play those sit-down cabinets. The Super Nintendo game is a bit of a technical marvel, considering it has no FX chip helping it out. The frame rate definitely suffers for it too. The Genesis version is quite a bit faster and smoother than the Super Nintendo version. And it doesn't need to have the game in 1/3 of the screen either, just half of the screen. Yeah, I zoomed in to make it fit your phone screen a little bit better. Believe it or not, I actually spent some real time playing the Super Nintendo game, and I kinda got used to that slow frame rate after a while, but there's really no advantage to playing it over the Genesis game. Raiden Trad. This is a popular top-down shooter which has appeared on practically everything, even the Atari Jaguar and Lynx. The Super Nintendo game looks and plays nearly the same as the arcade, but there is one obvious difference. The original game was vertically oriented while the Super Nintendo game is horizontal. It's even more pronounced considering the Super Nintendo's screen stretching issue. There's also a bit of slowdown when there's lots of bullets on the screen. The Sega version does a better job of orienting the screen by having the score and stats on the right side. Also, there's no slowdown that I've noticed. Colors are a little dull, as are the backgrounds, but they were in the original game too, so it's a wash. So yeah, the screen stretching is really distracting here once you notice it. It's still a fun version of the original, but I'd lean towards playing the Genesis game. RoboCop 3. This game is a side-scrolling shooter game supposedly based on the movie. However, it's so dang hard I've never been able to get very far. I mean, I think RoboCop should be practically invulnerable, right? It's a decently fun game otherwise, with colorful and detailed graphics. I do like the music here, which is catchy and of high quality. As expected, the Genesis game is a little grittier looking thanks to its diminished color palette. But I think that helps the game look more realistic. It's still freaking hard as nails though. Between the two, I like the Genesis version's more realistic look and gritty music, which matches the movie better. The Super Nintendo game is fun too, but it's a little cartoony for RoboCop. Rock and Roll Racing. Here we have an isometric racing game set in an apocalyptic future.
Rip is about to blow! Jake jams into first!
You can collect power-ups to increase your car's abilities or bank account. The control is a standout feature for me. It's very tight and I never feel like my car is out of control. The Super Nintendo has some fantastic music and voice too.
Rip is about to blow!
Funny, I never knew there was a Genesis version of this game up until recently. Fortunately, it also has lots of power-ups and tight controls. The music is much grittier though, and a case could be made that it's more appropriate for a game like this. The voices are clear, but one thing I noticed was how the music cuts out when they're played. What the heck?
Viper looks lost out there. Jake jams into first. Last lap.
Rip is about to blow!
I feel like the Genesis is unable to match the Super Nintendo in terms of graphics and sound quality here. It's still a fun game, but I'd say the Super Nintendo really dominated this race.
About to blow!
Shaq Fu. This is a one-on-one fighting game starring former basketball player Shaquille O'Neal, and it is legendary in its suckitude. I will say, though, that the stages are really colorful and detailed, although it turns out that it only has 6 of them. What? Also, the gameplay is just off. It feels too fast somehow, and the jumping is too wide. Here's the Genesis game, and shocker, it's just as bad as the Super Nintendo game. The colors actually seem a little brighter here, though. Of course, the music is kind of scratchy, and the controls and gameplay are just as bad as in the Super Nintendo version. I don't know, both feel just too fast. But hey, at least the Genesis game has more characters. So I think it's pretty clear that the Genesis game is better because there's just more of it. Well, wait a second, maybe that's a bad thing, I don't know. Either way, I would totally avoid both of these games. Unless I'm forced to, I will never play this game again. Side Pocket. This is a pool simulator game that has some really great physics. I played this on the Nintendo NES a bunch and was excited when it was released for the Super Nintendo and Genesis. Basically, you just hit all the balls into the pockets in order. You get points if you pocket them sequentially and numerically. The Super Nintendo version has some nice visuals over the original game, which is expected. The music is fantastic and the sound of the balls hitting is perfect. The Sega version's music is very good, but the horn sound effect is a little rough on the ears. Also, the table doesn't look quite as realistic as on the Super Nintendo game. What's great about this version, though, is that you can fine-tune where you hit the cue ball and how you angle the stick. I rarely do that, though. Side Pocket is a fun game and great if you like knocking your balls around.
Nice shot!
I don't know why, but it seems like the Genesis game is a bit easier, but ultimately, I feel like these games are evenly matched, so this is a tie. The Simpsons, Bart's Nightmare. Is this the second Simpsons game? Oh man, if only the arcade game had been ported home instead of this. Because this is a frustrating collection of mini-games, all tied together under the guise of Bart's nightmares. I've only been able to see a couple of the stages, and none of them appeal to me. At least it looks like the show. I mean, at least it's got that going for it. The Genesis version makes no improvements at all. The game looks bland when compared to the Super Nintendo game. Maybe that's a good thing though, because the cartoon looks fairly simple too. The fact that this appeared on the Genesis is an achievement though. I thought Simpsons were exclusively Nintendo games. No, I don't like either of these versions of the game and would avoid them both. The Super Nintendo game is a little nicer in the audio department though. Spider-Man and Venom, Maximum Carnage. Here we have a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as Spider-Man or Venom. It's based on the comic book of the same name and even includes some panels from it. The action is fast and fun, although it does get extremely repetitive, even more so than other beat-em-ups. The stages feel incredibly lifeless, but hey, at least you can throw trash cans now and then. Over on Sega, I immediately noticed how much brighter the visuals are. Whoa! Sounds are a little rough though, but the core gameplay is here. What's also here is the repetitive gameplay and dull stages. I guess that's to be expected though, since it's based on a comic. These games are essentially the same in terms of gameplay. The Super Nintendo has more detailed backgrounds and smoother sounds, however. Steel Talons. Atari Games 3D helicopter simulator game. The arcade featured easy-to-use controls that don't really translate well to the home market. You can fly up and down, but I rarely feel the need to do that. Just fly around and shoot enemy targets. That's all you gotta do. The Super Nintendo game is working hard to push even a few polygons without that FX chip. Unfortunately, the Super Nintendo version includes a HUD that takes over a good portion of the screen. The Sega game isn't much better, but the faster processor of the Genesis does a better job with the polygons. There's more mountains, which is a closer match to the arcade game. The downside, though, is that it's still a sluggish gaming experience. I'll take the Genesis game over the Super Nintendo here. It's far from being a masterpiece, but at least it tries to mimic the arcade. Super Street Fighter 2. The third Street Fighter game on the Super Nintendo adds new characters, stages, character animations, and an oddly happy announcer. Seriously, what's up with that?
You win!
While I still typically play as Ken, it's nice that 4 new characters are included. Cammy, Fei Long, DJ, and T-Hawk. The visuals are absolutely fantastic as one would expect, and the music and voice is nice and clear. The obvious downside to the Genesis game is the scratchy voice. Also, I noticed that the ROM size is 8 megabits larger than the Super Nintendo game. What the heck did they use it for? The controls are great here, especially if you're using the 6-button controller, as it matches the arcade perfectly. Both versions of the game are fantastic. The Super Nintendo might have smoother sounds, but strangely, the Genesis has brighter colors. Aside from the better sounds on the Super Nintendo, I really don't see a significant gameplay advantage of one game over the other.
You win! Perfect!
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters.
Turtle Combat!
Of course there had to be a Ninja Turtle one-on-one fighting game. On Super Nintendo, we had 10 characters, including the Turtles and Shredder, and some weird ones I've never heard of, like Asuka, Wingnut, and Armagon. Were they in the cartoon? Gameplay is surprisingly good. You have 2 punches and 2 kicks, as well as unique special moves. Bright and colorful graphics and great sounds keep me interested in this one. The Genesis version doesn't fare as good. There's only 8 characters, but 3 are unlocked in the Cowabunga collection for modern consoles. Hey, at least April's one of the original 8. Seems kind of strange that she wasn't in the Super Nintendo game. What's worse than the colors looking so drab is the gameplay. It is just annoying. Maybe it's the Genesis controls. 2 buttons are used for punches and kicks, and you have to press forward to do a strong attack. I don't know, I think they could have figured out a better way. I really wanted to like the Genesis game, but it's the Super Nintendo version that wins out here. It's just better looking and better playing. Terminator 2 Judgement Day. Here's another awful game. Seriously, why did I pick so many bad games for this video? Anyway, this is based on the movie, and you get to play as Arnie. Hooray! Start off by beating up bikers, collecting their weapons, finding future technology, and then finding John Connor's address. There are so many enemies, it is totally ridiculous. Come on, man, give me a break. And then when you get to the motorcycle stage, I can't freaking figure out how to turn this thing the way I want it. Oh my gosh. Come on, turn already. That's it, I give up. However, on the Genesis game, I was able to turn the motorcycle and find John's house. At which point, I was attacked by the T-1000 all while listening to this annoying klaxon. Give my ears a freaking break. I wasn't able to figure out what to do here, though. Yeah, I never want to play this game ever again. Both of these versions are rage-inducing piles of trash. Wolfchild. This was originally a computer game that appeared on the Amiga and Atari ST. I think it being a computer game is why I like it. You play as Saul, who is out to stop an evil chimera by collecting energy to turn into a wolf. You can then shoot blasts from your, paws, I guess? The visuals look very clean, and the sound and music are great. Over on Genesis, the music is a little bit more upbeat. And the system's lack of colors really shows with all that dithering in the background. You can't hide that stuff from me. I do like the gameplay and tight controls of the game. I find this to be a pretty cool game. Apparently the original computer game reviews were middle of the road though, but I could actually see myself playing through this one, so long as it's on easy mode. So anyway, let's call this one a tie. WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. Here's one I may have seen in the arcade when it was released. A friend of mine was a huge wrestling fan, and I kind of remembered him playing it. This could be the Mandela effect, though, I'm not sure. Anyway, this is a fast and wild wrestling game featuring 6 whole characters on Super Nintendo. There's a ton of high-quality voice in the game, and it works quite well.
Unbelievable! That's gotta hurt!
The gameplay isn't as enjoyable though. I mean, I can't even beat the first opponent, and I know I don't suck at games that bad.
Unbelievable! What's this?
The Genesis game feels a little rougher in the sound department. Big surprise there. Character graphics aren't bad, but the backgrounds are pretty dull. The saving grace for this version, though, is the fact that you can choose from 8 characters. The Super Nintendo game has choppy controls, fewer songs, and fewer characters. Meanwhile, the Genesis game just offers more despite its rather dark visuals.
It's a total debacle!
Alright, well there you go. Another 32 games compared between these two Titan systems. I cover more games in round 1 of this series, and I'll cover even more in round 3. Anyway, thanks for watching, take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye everyone.